For days after he found the child, 3 Apache women stood at his door. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Arizona Territory, winter of 1882. And the land was the kind that kept its secrets only from those who didn't know how to look. Reed Hostin never cared much for the north fence. It ran crooked through brittle brush and sun-bleached stone, always leaning, always asking for repairs, always far enough from the cabin that he could pretend it wasn't his problem unless something forced his hand. A snapped post, a wandering animal, or that tight pull in the gut that told him something wasn't right. That morning it was the last one. He'd risen before the light, same as always, fed the mules, checked the shed door that never quite latched, ground his coffee slow and steady, the way he did everything. His cabin, rough timber walls, a single stovepipe, a roof patched with bark and stubborn hope, had sat quiet through the night. No visitors, no sounds but the wind. Still, something pressed at him from the inside, a quiet insistence that wouldn't let go. He tried to ignore it, didn't take. So he saddled up and rode northeast, the wind cutting straight through his coat and leaving the backs of his hands raw. The plains stretched wide and empty, the kind of open country that showed you everything except when it didn't. Years ago, Reed had learned not to watch for what was there, but for what wasn't. The stillness where movement should be, the shape that didn't belong. That was what caught his eye. At first it looked like nothing more than a low mound near the base of a fence post where the wire sagged loose. Could have been a sack, maybe a dead coyote dragged and half buried by grit and time. But it wasn't. He slowed the mule and swung down, boots crunching against frozen dirt. He moved in careful, one hand hovering near his holster out of habit. Though his gut already knew this wasn't danger, it was worse. It was a child, a small boy, Apache by the look of him, no more than 5 or 6, curled tight into himself, like he was trying to vanish, barefoot, ribs pressing sharp beneath thin skin, one cheek against the cold ground, lips cracked and dry. His hands were small, fingers stiff and turning color. A thin buckskin shirt hung from his frame, torn along one sleeve. No coat, no blanket. Ash from a long dead fire had blown into his hair. Reed crouched and let out a breath through his nose. He scanned the land. No tracks, no smoke, no sign of life in any direction. Just a boy dying slow and alone. Reed hesitated, not because he didn't care, but because he'd been alone a long time, and taking someone in wasn't a small thing. Not out here, not with winter beginning to show its teeth. The last person he'd held had been his wife 6 years earlier, slipping away in a bed that smelled of sickness and pine oil. Since then, it had been just him, the mules and the cattle, and that had been by choice. This wasn't. He shrugged off his heavy coat, thick canvas lined with wool, the same coat that had carried him through the last winter, and wrapped it around the boy with steady hands. He didn't speak. The child couldn't hear him anyway. Reed slid his arms beneath the small body and lifted him, surprised by how little weight there was, just bone and skin. As he turned back toward the mule, the wind came up hard, striking his chest and forcing his eyes shut for a second. He looked out across the empty land one last time, hoping to see someone, anyone, then muttered under his breath, "All right then." The ride back took 20 minutes. He didn't rush. The boy was cradled in one arm, the reins loose in the other. With each hoofbeat, something settled into place inside him. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't charity. This was his responsibility now. Inside the cabin, the stove still held warmth from the morning fire. Reed fed it dry cedar, cleared the cot near it, and laid the boy down gently, leaving his coat wrapped tight around him. He watched the color creep back into the child's skin in slow waves. He heated water, washed the boy's hands with a cloth, noticed the cuts, the dirt ground beneath the nails, the dark bruises along his upper arms. He didn't ask what had happened. The boy couldn't have answered. Reed thinned beans with fat, salt and water, let it cool in a tin cup, then knelt, lifting the boy's head just enough to touch the cup to his lips. The boy swallowed. That was enough. Reed stayed there, knees aching against the floor, one hand resting on the child's shoulder. Not to comfort him, but to remind himself this was real, that someone else was breathing in his home, that someone else mattered. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the stove, watching the boy's chest rise and fall beneath the furs while the wind hammered the walls. There was no plan, no explanation, just the certainty that something in him wouldn't let that child die, alone out there. The boy didn't speak that day or the next. Reed didn't push. He didn't ask for a name or a story. The child ate when fed, drank when prompted, slept more than anything. When awake, his eyes tracked Reed, cautious but not afraid, just watching. Reed fixed the busted door hinge, split more wood, checked the fence, fed the cattle. He moved through his routines with the same quiet discipline. Only now there was an extra plate on the table, and he cooked more than one portion without thinking about it. That was how he'd lived since the war. Do the next thing, then the next. Don't look too far ahead. By the third evening, the boy stood on his own near the stove, barefoot, holding a cup with both hands. His legs still shook. Reed noticed how often the boy glanced toward the door, like he was waiting. Reed set his coffee down and leaned forward. "Someone coming for you?" he asked, plain and steady. The boy didn't answer, fingers tightening around the cup. Reed didn't ask. Again, but the question lodged deep and stayed there as the fire burned low. The answer came the next morning just before dawn. Reed had stepped outside for kindling when the mule snorted and backed, away from the fence. Reed followed its gaze. 3 figures stood in the pale gray light on a low rise beyond the cabin, women Apache close. Enough that their breath showed. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there while the wind tugged at their long skirts and braided hair. Reed felt his gut draw tight. He glanced back toward the cabin where the boy slept, then turned to face them. They were worn, not just tired, but stripped down by survival. Moccasins crusted with dust and mud. Long deerskin dresses torn at the seams. Beadwork dulled, shell stitching loose. One woman carried a wrapped bundle on her back. Another wore an old hunting knife tied at her waist with cloth. Their cheeks were sunburned raw, arms thin from hunger. The one in front stepped forward alone. She was strong-bodied, wide at the hips, her chest full beneath the loosened laces of a torn bodice that gaped with each breath. Her eyes never left his. When she spoke, her voice was low and even. "You have our son." No threat, no anger, just truth. Reed's jaw tightened as his mind worked. The boy had said nothing, but the signs were there. This woman had searched for days, maybe longer. Reed looked past her at the others, one younger with restless eyes, the other slender and folded into herself. He held the woman's gaze. "He's inside, still asleep." She nodded once and waited. Reed stepped aside. "Come in." They moved without hesitation. When the warmth hit them, their bodies stiffened. The woman crossed the floor and dropped to her knees beside the cot. The boy stirred, then his eyes lit up, and he climbed into her arms, burying his face against her chest. She wrapped around him tight, lips brushing his hair. No tears, just holding on. Reed poured water into a cup and set out what food he had. "Eat," he said. They did, slow and quiet. After a time, the woman looked up. "I'm Asha." Reed nodded. "Reed, why did you help him?" she asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. Didn't feel right leaving him. Asha studied him, then said softly, "No, it wouldn't have been." By the 4th morning, the wind eased. Not warm, not kind, but no longer cruel. Reed woke to the sound of quiet movement instead of silence. Asha was awake, stirring the fire. Jula sat beside her, sewing a torn seam with careful fingers. Wren stood near the door, watching the horizon like she expected trouble to come walking out of it. The boy slept on, breathing deep and steady. His small hand curled into the fur at his chest. Reed watched them all and understood something he hadn't let himself feel in years. The cabin had changed, so had he. After breakfast, Asha stood facing him. "We cannot stay forever," she said. "But winter will not let us leave yet." Reed nodded. He already knew that. "You can stay till it does," he replied. "No." Ceremony, no conditions, just fact. Asha studied his face, then inclined her head once, not gratitude, but respect. The days settled into a rhythm. The women helped without asking. Reed mended fence wire with quick hands. Tula cooked, cleaned, and sang softly when she thought no one listened. Asha worked beside Reed, silent but steady, sharing the weight without words. The boy laughed again. Not loud, but real. When the first heavy snow finally came, it found a cabin no longer hollow. Reed stood at the door that night, watching white swallow the plains. Asha came to stand beside him. Their shoulders touched, just barely. She didn't pull away. "You gave him life," she said. Reed shook his head. "No, just time." She looked up at him then, eyes strong and sure. "Time is everything." The fire burned low behind them. Outside, the world slept. Inside, something broken had finally found its shape again, and for the first time since he buried his wife beneath a lonely pine. Reed Holston did not face the winter alone.